A lot to talk about. Let's get to our panel. From Milton Keynes in the United Kingdom via Skype, Ammar Waqqaf is the founder and director of the think tank Gnosos and a Syrian political analyst. From Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer is a defense analyst and columnist for the Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta. Yusuf Alabarda is an international security and politics expert joining us from Istanbul. And here in our studio, Theodore Kattouf is a former US ambassador to Syria. Welcome to all of you. Yusuf Alabarda, let me start with you in Istanbul. President Erdogan has been in Brussels for talks with the European Union. What was the goal of that visit?
The goal of that visit is that the refugee crisis, which is being inside Syria, started to become a big problem for Europe, especially since from 2 weeks, because Turkey clearly declared that he will not be hosting for more than 4 million refugees, and enough is enough. For the extra refugees who is coming, especially from Syria, Turkey will not be able to stop them in accordance with the international law. And all of a sudden, the European Union countries started to take into consideration what Turkey is saying and started to blame Turkey for blackmailing all the Europeans. But let's remember that Turkey is the world's largest refugee hosting country in all over the world. For this reason, the reason why Mr. Erdogan is in Brussels now is to try to find a solution to the refugee crisis, especially stemming from Syria crisis.
So, Yusuf, for President Erdogan, the best case scenario is that Europe takes some of those refugees.
Yeah, this is one of the best scenarios, that some of them should leave to the Europe because there is a burden sharing in terms of the refugee sharing according to the United Nations regulations also. For this reason, what Mr. Erdogan wants from Europe, that let's find a solution, political solution, what's going on inside Syria first, and then later let's burden the share what's going on inside Turkey.
All right, let me go to Ammar Waqqaf in Milton Keynes in the United Kingdom. Ammar, President Erdogan has also been holding talks with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. Tensions have been rising between Russia and Turkey because these two countries are on opposite sides of this conflict in Syria. In fact, some reports say that the two countries were on the brink of war, but they've had 6 hours of talks. They agreed on a ceasefire. Question is, will that ceasefire hold? And more importantly, will President Assad respect the ceasefire?
Well, we think this agreement wouldn't have taken place without clear consent from President Assad. Syria, the Syrian government, is the key stakeholder in what is happening in northeastern Syria. Whatever it needs, whatever it wants, must be on the table. Otherwise, it could ruin any agreement between whoever they are. So we believe President Assad and the Syrian government have been, at least in the preparation phase, heavily involved in the preparation phase for this particular agreement. Now, regardless of the whole setup of relations, current relations between the three sides, Syria, Russia and Turkey, may seem adversarial, but actually all three countries, all three players, pretty much need each other to make things happen. So it's not quite the confrontation that we think is happening. Probably every single side is pulling things towards them, their interests, trying to push things on the ground, declare intent of escalation, just to secure that extra bit of concession from the other sides. But actually, what they have been doing for the past 3 years throughout the Astana process is that they have been cooperating. We've seen a lot of reduction of violence. We've seen the Syrian government regaining slowly and surely certain areas in northeastern Syria. And people, in a sense, the fighting has reduced a lot. So you could argue it has been a success. The latest episode may have looked a little bit more confrontational, and as you might have said, as you said, they might have gone into war. But we've always thought that things will come to understanding right at the end, and all sides saw the outcome of the game.
Ambassador, of course, this is a very complex situation. Turkey is a member of NATO, but in recent years, its relationship with Russia has been gaining strength. In fact, it has been buying weapons from Russia as well. But in Syria, they're on opposite sides of the conflict. And, you know, as we've seen these reports, that this could escalate to a point where the Russians and the Turks could be fighting each other on the ground. Looking at the view from the United States, this is what the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said about the conflict. Let's listen to this.
We believe firmly that our NATO partner, Turkey, has the full right to defend itself against the risk that's being created by what Assad, the Russians, and the Iranians are doing inside of Syria.
So there's pretty brave talk there from Secretary Pompeo saying that Turkey has a right to defend itself. Turkey is a member of NATO. Do you see the doctrine of collective defense being invoked here?
I don't. Even Erdogan hasn't seemed to be pushing it. Mm-hmm. And while Secretary of State Pompeo, as you said, had rather bold words, mm-hmm. I didn't hear anything from him about what the U.S. would be prepared to do if there was conflict. Let's remember that Turkish forces or Turkish-backed forces are operating within Syria. Syria and Russia are not operating within Turkey.
So what role do you see for the United States in this, if any role at all?
Well, the United States is an ally of Turkey, even though Turkey, against our wishes, bought the S-400 anti-aircraft missile system from Russia. It's been trying to play both countries off a bit against the other. Putin obviously pokes the U.S. whenever he has a chance in that region, and he's trying to establish Russia as the predominant power broker in the Middle East. And Trump, to some extent, seems willing to accommodate that because he wants, as has become clear, to withdraw U.S. forces from the region. So I see right now the U.S., unless our forces are attacked, which could happen, as just playing a role behind the scenes, talking to all the parties and trying to warn them against what they already appear not to want, which is a conflict with one another.
All right, let's bring in Pavel Felgenhauer from Moscow. Pavel, you know, as we heard from Ammar Waqqaf earlier on, each of the countries involved in this, of course, have their own self-interest. Russia is now deeply committed in Syria. What is Russia's interest?
Well, Russia intervened in Syria to secure the victory of the Assad regime in the civil war. This was also coming, of course, the request came from Damascus and also from Tehran. The Iranians were also doing on the same job, but they were not actually coping despite bringing in Hezbollah and other militias. So they needed Russia. Russia moved in. And Russian main interest strategically is the basis that it has established in Syria, the naval base in Tartus, where Russia has invested a lot into expanding it and having a permanent naval presence in the eastern Mediterranean, and in the Khmeimim air base, because you don't have a viable naval presence against NATO in the Mediterranean if you don't have air cover and air support. So that's the main Russian strategic interest, to project power into the Mediterranean and into the Aegean, and of course it's the Suez and the Black Sea Straits that are very important, seen as very important. But that also means that Russia is going to insist that Assad is in power and that the civil war ends in his favor. That is very, very important, that the war should be declared over, that reconstruction in Syria should begin, and Syria should get not just humanitarian aid, but financial aid. Because Tehran cannot do that because of American sanctions. The Iranians ran out of money. While the Turkish-backed armed opposition keeps parts of Idlib, the civil war is not over, reconstruction can't begin, so that means this ceasefire that was agreed in Moscow is just a provisional one.
So what do you make of that ceasefire, that agreement that was made in Moscow?
Well, it is a provisional agreement. It kind of freezes the situation as it is, the line of control. But there are no provisions in it for any serious withdrawal of forces that are standing out there, and no kind of observers, no demilitarized zones. Ceasefires organized like that, just stopping fighting on the battlefield, don't last. But right now, at present, it's more or less lasting because the regime forces, its allies, and the Syrian opposition are so exhausted after a couple of months of severe fighting and severe losses, especially by the regime in the last several weeks, a couple of weeks from Turkish attack, that right now they are not ready to continue the fight. They are keeping the ceasefire. But after they kind of recollect their fighting capability, I'm afraid it will begin again.
Yusuf Alabarda, there are various views on this agreement that was reached in Moscow. Reuters reports that Russia actually got the better end of that deal because it cements the gains made by Syrian forces against the rebels who are backed by Turkey. To put it another way, the Reuters report says that this consolidates Assad's gains on the battlefield and gives Russia a chance to deploy even deeper in Idlib. Do you agree with that?
To some degree, yes, but to tell the truth, this agreement was a win-win situation because what was offered to Turkey in the talks inside Moscow before Mr. Erdogan and Putin met with each other was only a concentration camp just nearby the border. So it was clearly stated to Turkey to withdraw all its forces to the border of Turkey, and they couldn't come to a conclusion. And all of a sudden, a deadly airstrike came to the Turkish soldiers, and everyone was expecting that the Turkish leadership will shy away and will withdraw all its forces to the Turkish border. But when it comes to the reality, it didn't happen like that, and all of a sudden, the Turkish armed forces started to infiltrate to the air defense systems of the Syrian Arab regime, by applying a huge electronic warfare, and 3 fighting aircrafts, 5 helicopters, 2 airfields, more than 100 tanks has been demolished by the Turkish armed forces. For this reason, no one was also expecting that Turkey will escalate this situation to this point. For this reason, everyone compromised from its position. They accepted 35 or 40 kilometers secure zone according to the agreement which has been signed inside Moscow. And also the Russian side has compromised that the Turkish troops didn't withdraw to the borders. For this reason, to some degree, it is a win-win position because of the highly intense and technological assault which was done by the Turkish armed forces.
Ambassador, as you pointed out, the United States' involvement in this part of the world is relatively small. But if we look at the bigger picture, the bigger strategic regional picture, I mean, would the United States have concerns that Russia's going to have a foothold in Syria?
Of course, the United States has concerns about Russian influence, but we have to remember that Russia, or before it, the Soviet Union, has always had Syria as a friend in the Middle East. This regime, the Assad regime, has been in power literally 50 years. And almost all that time, they've been closely coordinating their foreign affairs and military affairs with the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation. I think the U.S. is more concerned these days about Iranian encroachments in Iraq, the rise of tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran, keeping Egypt as an ally. And let's remember, right now, who is going to rebuild Syria? Where's the money going to come from? It may not be the great prize that some people portray it for Putin.
Okay. Ammar Waqqaf, President Erdogan's view is that this deal that he made in Moscow prevents another influx of refugees into Turkey. Turkey is already hosting something like 4 million Syrian refugees. And President Erdogan also said that the EU needs to keep to its side of the bargain, or he will open Turkey's borders to those refugees so that they'll be able to enter Europe. This is how the German Chancellor Angela Merkel responded to that. Let's listen to this.
With all understanding and every readiness to talk in order to provide more support, I think it is unacceptable to deal with it at the expense of migrants, because they have been motivated to go to the border and end up at a dead end. And our policy and the policy of the EU-Turkey deal is such as not to do politics at the expense of migrants, but rather find agreements between states to neither bring the migrants into a more difficult situation nor make life easier for the traffickers.
So, Ammar Waqqaf, someone used the term blackmail earlier on. Do you think that President Erdogan is threatening Europe here?
Well, President Erdogan has tried to secure a European or NATO political and even military power for his side of the story, of his side of interest or adventure inside Syria. We've seen NATO and Europe being very reluctant to go as far as President Erdogan wants. In 2015, they withdrew, for example, Patriot missiles from Syrian border. They didn't want to engage, they didn't want to give President Erdogan everything that he needs so that he can go and do whatever he likes in Syria and probably bring other NATO members and Europe into clash with the US, with Russia. But he's been, you could argue, blackmailing Europe with refugees. But the most recent episode, ever since the most recent episode, he was clearly looking for someone to cover his adventure inside northeastern Syria in Idlib, and he wanted Europe to. He tried to sell a no-fly zone, he tried to sell a safe zone, he tried to sell whatever he wanted, Patriot missiles, but NATO and Europe have been reluctant because they could see the end game. They could see that this might lead to a confrontation or more serious confrontation with Russia, and NATO doesn't want that. Or at least, if NATO wants to go into such a confrontation, it wouldn't be at one party's adventure, so to speak. Now, with regards to the refugees, Europe has been far more prepared this time around than in 2013, 2014, because the public inside Europe has sort of had enough refugees, and it's definitely not only Syrians, and we can see all the reports coming that these are the majority of Afghan, Iraqi, whatever, very few Syrians. In fact, the percentage of Turkish people trying to cross into Europe is more than Syrians on the Turkish-Greek border. So basically, they have the internal backing up or the mandate from their population, from their electorate, constituencies, to push back these immigrants and have a tougher stance with President Erdogan.
Yusuf Alabarda, it seems that on the question of refugees, the views are hardening on both sides, on the European side as well as the Turkish side. And if we look at what President Erdogan said, that he could possibly open his borders to these refugees entering Europe, what are his options besides that?
The biggest option that can be done to address to the root causes of the refugee crisis. Otherwise, the refugee crisis, which is going on inside Europe, cannot be only the burden of the Turkey. Let alone, as a security analyst, let me speak by myself. As a taxpayer, every year I only pay something like $500 for the refugee crisis which is going on inside Turkey. And those are not my problem because they have international protection, United Nations protection, and they have a right to choose to wherever they want to go. So forcing Turkey, keep them inside your country, and I don't want to listen to you, I don't want to address to the root causes of the problem, will never solve the problem. So the best option that can be done, especially in terms of Syria, we should address to the root causes of the problem, and we should find a political solution to the Syrian crisis. Whoever talks at the summits always dictates and underlines that the Syrian problem can be solved only in terms of policy and political terms. But when it comes to the reality, everyone is trying to solve the problem with the military usage. For this reason, I do think that the best option to address to the Syrian crisis and to finish the Syrian crisis as soon as possible. That will make the European countries feel better.
Pavel Felgenhauer, Ambassador Kattouf told us just a moment ago, one of the other big questions is what happens when the civil war ends. Syria would have to be rebuilt. How deep is the Russian commitment to Syria? Will Syria come forward and help with that reconstruction process?
Well, Russia has been supplying Syria with weapons, with a different kind of other equipment, with a lot of goods, the so-called Syrian Express, as the Turks gave that name, and the Russian military like it. It's bringing about 2,000 tons a day of supplies, and they're coming pro bono. to Syria, but Russia cannot possibly take over full kind of responsibility for keeping the Assad regime actually ticking. During the long Syrian war, the main money supplier was Iran, and now Iran is out of money because of Trump's sanctions. So that means someone has to step in. Russia cannot do it. Russia has been calling on the European countries, on rich Arab countries to step in. Right up to now, no one is actually really responding. There is humanitarian aid is coming, reconstruction not. Right now, the Syrian pound, they give more than 1,000 for $1. Syria is in a kind of economic financial meltdown. And this can actually affect the Syrian regime. There can be renewed, if not a revolution, or at least serious protests in those parts of Syria that with Russian and Iranian help have been kind of liberated, as they say in Damascus, by the regime forces. So something has to be done. The war should be declared ended. That's why ending up the Syrian opposition positions in Idlib is so important for the Assad regime and its allies.
Ambassador, you've been a United States diplomat for a long time. You've been ambassador to Syria. This is one of the most volatile parts of the world. To Yusuf Alabarda's point that what needs to happen in Syria is a political solution, do you see a viable political solution happening in Syria in which President Assad would have to share power with others?
Well, that's been the goal of the U.S. all along, whether it's been the Obama administration, Secretary of State John Kerry under Obama, or even the current administration, is that there are UN resolutions concerning a settlement in Syria, that there has to be power sharing, et cetera. But the Assad regime hasn't stayed in power 50 years because it's willing to negotiate with oppositionists and give them a big role, et cetera. And Assad and regime hasn't fought to liberate, as they would put it, every inch of Syrian territory, which they're still doing in Idlib, in order to give a lot of concessions to the opposition. So what we're seeing now is a crash in oil prices. Iran has its own deep internal problems, as does Iraq. Russia's going to be hurt economically by all of this. The only scenario I can see in which there might be some compromise on the part of the Assad regime, if the economy becomes so devastated that they can't continue to govern properly without getting international aid, which, as I said, is not going to come without a political compromise.
Right. Yusuf Alabarda, I said earlier on that one of the big concerns for President Erdogan, of course, is the refugee situation in Turkey. But he has another concern as well, doesn't he? And that is the impact this refugee crisis is having on domestic politics in Turkey. I was looking at one poll conducted recently which showed that half of those surveyed in that poll were against any new operations by the Turks. Only 31%, just under a third, supported new operations. How big a problem is that for President Erdogan?
I do not believe to those numbers, to tell the truth, because I was on the field in both 3 different operations. I was on the ground, and I can sense that the Turkish people can support their government if the government persuades them that this is very important from their perspective of security. For example, when I was in the border cities of the Turkey, they do still remember that the bombs which has happened inside the Hatay province of the Turkey, and they do not want to live it again with the new refugee flux which is coming inside Turkey. For this reason, another problem may be that the Erdogan is facing, the Turkish nation believes that the refugee number 4 million is enough. For this reason, it is affecting the balance of the political situation inside Turkey. And Erdogan is aware of this situation. For that reason, he does not want to accept extra 2 million refugees who is coming from the Idlib area, and at the same time will create a security problem for Turkey, because Turkey also accepts that in this area there are radical groups who is operating inside the Idlib area. For this reason, it is a mixed blessing that are both positive sides and the negative sides from the perspective of the Erdogan, but especially for the political side, Erdogan is losing the ground because of the refugee problem which is going inside Turkey. I know some cities, even their demographies has changed after these refugee crisis started. For example, the city of the Kilis now hosting more refugees than it is population. For this reason, Erdogan says to the European Union, if extra 2 million comes to my border, I will never hold those 4 million people inside my country.
Ammar Waqqaf, one final question. The civil war seemingly is coming to an end now, or certainly is in its final phases. What is the Assad government's game plan?
Well, let's just think of the Assad government or the Syrian government's constituency aspirations. It would be very hard for the Syrian government to accept a political solution whereby all the sacrifices by this constituency has been basically annulled. They would need to get some gains. So a political solution that brings the Muslim Brotherhood sort of project into the Syrian government is pretty much out of the question for these people. And one issue or one thought out of this is that probably for both Assad and Putin, better the devil you know. If they sort of humiliate Syria or Turkish army, and that has a backlash inside Turkey, and President Erdogan is weakened, you never know who might come and probably turn his back to Russia and go to NATO. And there is another dynamic that is developing at the moment, also because of Turkish involvement in Northern Africa, in Libya to be more specific, is that Arab states who are against the Turkish-Qatari sort of axis are warming up seemingly to Syria because they can see it now as a confrontational point against Turkey, so that they can actually, get some gains for geopolitical gains against Turkey and Qatar.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.